The last surgery Sara Connolly performed before her life fell apart was a 12-hour reconstructive procedure on a 42-year-old mother of 3. Sara stood at the operating table in the cold, humming light of the surgical suite, her hands moving with the kind of practiced precision that had taken 15 years to build. 15 years of sacrifice, 15 years of skipped holidays, cancelled dates, missed funerals, and birthday cakes eaten alone in hospital break rooms. Her fingers did not shake, her eyes did not wander. She was, by every measurable standard, brilliant. But somewhere around hour 9 something shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden collapse, no trembling hands, no alarming mistake. It was quieter than that. It was the moment Sara looked down at her own gloved hands and could not remember, for just a few terrifying seconds, why she had ever wanted this. She finished the surgery. She always finished. She sutured the last layer of tissue with the same careful attention she had given the first. She spoke to the family afterward in the waiting room, gave them the news they had been praying for, watched the mother's husband dissolve into grateful tears, and she felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief, not even the hollow professional pride she had been running on for the past 3 years. Nothing. She drove home to her apartment that night, a sleek, expensive, almost entirely impersonal space in a high-rise in the city, and she sat on her couch in her scrubs without turning on the lights. Just sat there in the dark, listening to the traffic below. And sometime around 2 in the morning, she started to cry. She cried for a long time. She was not even sure what she was crying about at first. Exhaustion, maybe. The peculiar loneliness of a life spent in service to other people's emergencies. The dawning awareness that she had not spoken to anyone she truly loved, not a real conversation, not in months, maybe longer. She thought about her mother. Margaret Connolly had been calling every Sunday for years, leaving voicemails that Sara always promised herself she would return, and rarely did. Margaret still lived in Clover Falls, the small coastal town where Sara had grown up. The town Sara had left at 18 with a full scholarship, a fierce ambition, and the absolute certainty that she was destined for something larger than its quiet streets could contain. She had been right in a way. She had built something large, a career that other surgeons respected, a reputation that preceded her into rooms, awards that gathered dust on a shelf she never looked at. But sitting in the dark of her 41st year, crying without quite knowing why large did not feel like enough. She called her mother the next morning and said very simply, "Mom, I need to come home." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Margaret Connolly was not a woman given to dramatic expressions of emotion, but Sara could hear something shift in her mother's voice when she answered. "I know, sweetheart," her mother said. "I've been waiting." Sara had not been back to Clover Falls in 4 years. She told herself it was because of work, which was true, but not entirely true. The fuller truth was that Clover Falls held things she had left unfinished, feelings she had folded up and tucked away in the back of some interior drawer, the kind of feelings a person tells themselves they have dealt with, when really they have just gotten very good at not looking directly at them. She packed a single bag, told her department head she needed a medical leave of absence, and drove north. The drive took most of a day. She passed through progressively smaller cities, then through suburbs that gave way to farmland, then through hills thick with old-growth pine, and then, finally, the road curved and the Pacific came into view, grey-green and enormous, and so familiar it made her chest ache. She had forgotten how beautiful it was. She had forgotten, or maybe she had chosen not to remember, because memory can be a complicated thing when it is tangled up with longing. Clover Falls was exactly the kind of town that people who grew up there described as either charming or suffocating, depending on how they had left. Population 3,000, give or take. One main street with a coffee shop, a hardware store, a bookshop that also sold candles and handmade cards, a small public library, a diner called Mabel's that had been there since 1962, and an old theatre that showed movies on weekends and hosted the occasional community play. A beach at the end of Harbour Road with a lighthouse at the northern point, hills behind the town covered in Douglas fir, fog most mornings, blackberries in late summer, the smell of salt and rain and wood smoke. Home, whether Sara wanted it to be or not. Her mother's house was a blue Victorian on Elm Street, 2 blocks from the beach. Margaret was standing on the porch when Sara pulled into the driveway, as if she had been watching for her, which she probably had. Sara barely got out of the car before her mother had her arms around her. Margaret was 68, and had the kind of steady, unsentimental warmth that some women grow into in their 60s, the kind that comes from having survived enough to know what matters. She held her daughter for a long moment without saying anything. "You feel thinner," Margaret said finally. "I'm fine, Mom." "I didn't say you weren't, I said you feel thinner." Margaret pulled back and looked at her daughter's face with the focused attention of someone conducting a careful assessment. "Come inside, I made soup." The house smelled exactly the way it always had, old wood and lemon polish and something baking. Sara stood in the entryway and felt 15 years old again, which was both comforting and slightly terrifying. She ate her mother's soup and let herself be fussed over, and she slept that night in her childhood bedroom under a quilt her grandmother had made, and she did not dream of operating rooms or fluorescent lights or the specific weight of holding someone's life in her hands. She slept for 10 hours, the longest she had slept in years. She had been in Clover Falls for 3 days before she allowed herself to think about Diana Reeves. She had been doing well at not thinking about Diana, which is to say she had been thinking about her constantly but framing it as something else, thinking about the town, about the past, about her youth in general, not specifically about the girl she had been in love with at 17. Not specifically about the morning she had left for college, and the way Diana had stood in this exact driveway and cried, and the way Sara had gotten into her father's old station wagon and driven away without fully understanding what she was leaving behind. "You are 19 years old," she had told herself then. "These feelings will pass." She had been wrong about that in the way that young people are sometimes spectacularly wrong about the things they most want to be right about. On the 4th day she went for a walk, just down to the beach, she told herself, just to feel the salt air. She walked down Harbour Road with her hands in her jacket pockets, watching the morning fog roll off the water, and she was not thinking about Diana. She was absolutely, definitively not thinking about Diana. And then she turned onto the beach path, and there was Diana Reeves. Diana Reeves was standing at the shoreline in rubber boots and a canvas jacket, looking out at the water with her hands in her pockets and her dark hair blowing in the wind. She looked the same, and completely different, and Sara's heart did the particular thing it had not done in 23 years, the unsubtle lurch of recognition that the body does not forget even when the mind tries to negotiate with it. Diana was 40 now. She had grown into herself in the way that some people do beautifully, the soft roundness of her teenage face sharpened into something more angular, more certain. There were lines around her eyes that had not been there at 17. Her dark hair was shorter than Sara remembered, cut to her jaw, and the wind was making a small chaos of it. She had not seen Sara yet. Sara stood very still on the beach path for 3 seconds, which felt like considerably longer, and then Diana turned her head. The moment their eyes met was like the sound a match makes when it catches. Diana's expression went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, something Sara could not quite name, before settling into something careful and contained. "Sara," she said. Her voice was low, a little rough, the same voice Sara had heard in her memory for 23 years without quite admitting it. "Diana," Sara walked toward her because what else could she do? She was aware of her own heartbeat in an uncomfortable way. "I heard you might still be in town." "From who?" "My mother." Diana almost smiled at that. Of course, she looked at Sara with that careful, measuring gaze. "You look tired." Sara laughed, a short, genuine sound. "Your powers of observation haven't changed. Neither has your habit of running yourself into the ground." Diana said it without cruelty, just plainly, the way someone speaks about a fact they have known for a long time. They stood there for a moment, the sea making its patient sound behind them, and the years between them present and enormous and somehow not quite the barrier Sara had imagined. "How long are you back for?" Diana asked. "I don't know," Sara said, and she realized as she said it that this was the truth. She genuinely did not know. Diana nodded, as if this was an answer she had considered the possibility of. She looked back at the water. "I come here most mornings, just to think, before everything starts." "Before everything starts," Sara repeated. "What does everything start with?" "The clinic," Diana said. "I run the medical clinic on Maple Street, have for about 6 years now." Sara blinked. "You're a doctor." "Nurse practitioner," Diana said. "It's not a surgery career at a major hospital." She glanced at Sara with something quick and warm in her eyes. "But it matters." The words landed quietly and did not move from where they landed. "It sounds like it matters a lot," Sara said. "It does." Diana looked at her steadily. "Do you want to walk?" They walked along the shoreline for an hour, talking in the careful, circling way that people do when they are navigating both a reunion and an old wound. They talked about their lives, the broad outlines first, the safer territories. Diana had gone to nursing school in the city, come back, worked at the county hospital for 3 years, then taken over the small clinic when its previous director retired. She owned a house on Birch Street. She had a dog, a large and apparently extremely opinionated golden retriever named Huckleberry. She had been in a relationship, a long one, with a woman named Claire, a landscape architect who had lived in Clover Falls for 7 years before taking a job in another state. That had been 2 years ago. Diana did not say she was over it, but she did not say she wasn't. She simply described it with the measured honesty of someone who has done the work of understanding a loss. Sara talked about her career, the surgeries, the awards, the department politics, the way success had accumulated until it felt less like an achievement and more like a pressure. She talked around the burnout for a while before she finally named it. "I stopped feeling it," she said. They had reached the northern end of the beach and stood near the lighthouse, watching the waves break on the rocks below. "The work, I couldn't feel why it mattered anymore. I just felt empty." Diana was quiet for a moment. How long had it been building? "Years," Sara admitted. "I think years. I just kept moving too fast to notice." "That sounds like you." Sara looked at her. "You say that like it's obvious." "It is obvious." Diana met her gaze with that directness that Sara had forgotten about, had tried to forget about, the particular quality of Diana's attention that had always made Sara feel completely seen and completely unnerved in equal measure. "You've been moving too fast since you were 17. You always thought that if you slowed down, something would catch up with you." The words sat between them, not accusatory, not cruel, just honest. Sara looked out at the water. "I used to think I was running towards something." "I know," Diana said softly. They were quiet for a while. The lighthouse stood above them, white and patient, marking the edge of the known. Sara began finding reasons to be on the beach in the mornings. This was not, she told herself, anything in particular. It was healthy. She needed the fresh air. She needed the exercise. She needed to remember what it felt like to breathe without the artificial, recycled air of a hospital. The fact that Diana Reeves also happened to be on the beach most mornings was simply a coincidence, a pleasant one. They fell into a rhythm without discussing it. Coffee first from the small stand near the beach path that opened at 7, and then a walk, sometimes long, sometimes just a circuit of the beach, depending on how much time Diana had before the clinic opened. They talked, about everything and about nothing, about patients in the anonymous way healthcare workers speak about the people who move through their care, about books, about the town which had changed in some ways and remained stubbornly itself in others, about their mothers, both of whom were now deep in the particular late-season friendship that long-term neighbors develop, a friendship composed largely of judgmental commentary on the neighborhood and mutual appreciation for baked goods. Sara began to feel something returning to her, slowly, like circulation coming back to a numb limb. Not her ambition exactly, which she was in no hurry to reclaim, but something under the ambition, something older and quieter, a sense of herself that the hospital life had gradually sanded away. She started sleeping through the night. She started eating real meals. She started noticing the small specific beauty of the place she had grown up and spent so many years dismissing. The way the fog lifted off the hills in the morning like a curtain being drawn, the way the light on the water changed every hour, the way Clover Falls moved through its days with the unhurried confidence of a place that had no particular need to prove itself. She helped her mother in the garden. She read novels she had been meaning to read for years. She went to Mabel's diner and ate pancakes and let herself be caught up in the easy, undemanding conversation of people who had known her since she was a child. And she spent time with Diana. More time than she had admitted, even to herself, that she wanted. 3 weeks into her return, Sara was helping Diana close up the clinic one evening when it happened. It had been a long day for Diana. A complicated case, a child with symptoms that needed careful sorting, a family who was frightened and needed time and patience that a busy urban hospital would not have given them. Sara had stopped by in the afternoon and ended up staying, talking through the case with Diana in the way they had discovered they worked well together. Sara's surgical background, complementing Diana's generalist care, two different kinds of knowledge making a fuller picture. They locked up at 7:30 and stood on the sidewalk outside the clinic in the last of the evening light. There was a warmth that had come into their conversation over the weeks, a ease, a shorthand, the kind that takes years to build and yet had rebuilt itself with unnerving speed. "Thank you," Diana said, "for today, for talking through Mrs. Patterson's case with me, it helped." "I'm glad," Sara meant it. She had felt in those hours at the clinic something she had not felt in years, useful in a way that felt personal, not performed, present in a way the operating room had stopped allowing. Diana looked at her for a moment. The evening light was making her eyes warm, amber where they were usually darker. "Can I ask you something?" Diana said. "Yes." "Are you happy, not in Clover Falls, in general, with the life you built?" She said it carefully, not unkindly, but with the precision of someone who genuinely needed to know. Sara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I built something impressive," she said finally. "I'm not sure it was the same thing as happiness." Diana nodded slowly. "What would happiness look like, do you think?" Sara looked at her. The question felt very large and very simple at the same time. "I think it would look like this," Sara said quietly. "This, what these past weeks have felt like." The air between them changed. It was not a dramatic change. There was no sudden thunderclap, no cinematic swelling of music. It was the quiet shift of something settling into place, like a key finding a lock it was made for. Diana looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked away, down at the sidewalk, and Sara watched the muscles of her jaw work briefly. "Sara," Diana said. Her voice was low and careful. "I know," Sara said. "You were gone for 23 years. "I know. And I did," Diana paused. "I did a lot of work to be okay with that. It took a long time, and I'm okay with it. I understand why you left. I did then too, even if I couldn't say so." She looked up. Her eyes were very bright. "But I can't do whatever this is becoming if you're going to leave again. I can't." Sara felt the weight of it, the fairness of it, and the courage it took to say it. "I don't know what I'm going to do," Sara said honestly. "I haven't figured that out yet. But I know that leaving without understanding what I was leaving was one of the great mistakes of my life." She took a breath. "I don't intend to make it again." Diana looked at her for a long time. "Okay," she said finally, "just that, okay." But the word contained a whole country of meaning. They did not rush. This was perhaps the most surprising thing about it, to Sara, who had spent her adult life in the urgency of emergency. Everything in her professional world had been fast, decisive, immediately consequential. She had brought those habits to her relationships too, what few real ones she had managed, and they had not served her well. But with Diana, there was a patience she had not expected to find in herself. They went to dinner at a restaurant in the next town, a quiet place with good wine and a view of the water, and they talked for 4 hours without noticing the time. They went to the bookshop together on a Saturday morning and spent 2 hours recommending books to each other and arguing about novels they had both loved and lost in different ways. They walked Huckleberry along the beach every morning, the three of them, and Sara had somehow become the kind of person who looked forward to being greeted with full-body enthusiasm by a large golden retriever. Diana invited her to dinner at her house on Birch Street. The house was completely Diana in a way that made Sara love it immediately. It was an old craftsman bungalow, lived in and carefully tended, with deep blue walls in the living room and an overgrown garden full of lavender and wild strawberries. Books everywhere. Art on the walls that were clearly chosen because they were loved, not because they matched anything. A kitchen that showed evidence of actual cooking, pots hanging from a rack above the stove, herbs growing in pots on the windowsill, a chipped ceramic bowl full of garlic on the counter. Diana made pasta from scratch, standing at the kitchen counter rolling dough with focused attention, while Sara sat on the kitchen stool and watched, and they talked, and the kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of garlic and rosemary, and something that felt very much like belonging. After dinner they sat on the back porch in the dark, with the sound of the frogs from the small garden pond and the distant suggestion of the sea, and Diana poured 2 glasses of wine, and they sat close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. "I want to tell you something," Diana said. "Okays. When you left, when you were 18 and you drove away and I stood in your mother's driveway and watched you go." She was looking at the garden, not at Sara. "I told myself it was okay. that you had this bigger life waiting for you and I had always known you would go and it was fine. She paused. But I wasn't fine. I was devastated, and for a long time I was angry at you for not seeming to understand that. Sara was very still. I know you didn't understand it, Diana continued. You were 18 and ambitious and the world was opening up for you and I don't blame you for going, I don't. She finally looked at Sara. But I need you to understand now so we're not carrying it, that it mattered, what we had mattered. You mattered to me in a way that took years to move through. Sara felt something break open in her chest, not painfully, more like a window being opened in a room that has been closed too long. I know, Sara said, her voice was not entirely steady. I knew even then, I think, but I told myself it was youth, that I would feel things that intensely again with someone else somewhere else. She looked down at her wine glass. I didn't, I had relationships, I cared about people, but I never felt. She stopped. What? Diana said quietly. This, Sara said, I never felt this particular. She gestured between them, a helpless gesture. Diana was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and took Sara's hand. They sat like that for a long time, hands interlaced, listening to the frogs and the distant sea, and it was the most peaceful Sara had felt in as long as she could remember. The first time Diana kissed her, it was raining. Not dramatically, not in the movie way where the rain pours down and the music rises, just the ordinary coastal rain of a Tuesday evening, soft and steady, the kind Clover Falls wore like a familiar coat. They had been walking back from Mabel's diner after dinner, and Diana had her umbrella but Sara had forgotten hers, and they were sharing the umbrella in the slightly impractical way that requires walking closely together, hips almost touching, arms brushing. They stopped at the corner of Harbour Road and Maple Street, which was where their paths home diverged. Diana turned to look at her. The street lamp made a small circle of gold in the grey evening. Her hair was damp at the edges and her cheeks were flushed from the cold, and she looked at Sara with an expression Sara had seen building for weeks and had not trusted herself to name. I've been thinking about doing something, Diana said. What? This, Diana said and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, brief, a question more than a statement. Sara felt it move through her, like the first real breath after a long time underwater. When Diana pulled back just slightly, her eyes searching Sara's face with that attentiveness she gave everything, Sara lifted her hand to Diana's jaw and kissed her again. Slower this time, an answer. The rain came down around them, soft and unhurried, and the street lamp held its circle of gold, and nothing about it was cinematic or dramatic. It was simply true. Sara called her department head the following week and formally requested an extended leave of absence. She had been vague in her initial request, framing it as medical leave without specifying the nature. Now she was more honest. I'm experiencing burnout, she said. Significant burnout, I need more time. Her department head, to his credit, responded with more grace than she had expected. He told her, been watching her run herself ragged for 3 years and had wondered when it would catch up. He approved 6 months. He said they would reassess. She told her mother. Margaret listened with the patient attention she gave everything, then said, And Diana. Sara looked at her. How did you know? Sara, her mother looked at her with fond exasperation. I've known Diana Reeves for 25 years. I watch the two of you walk past my window every morning. I'm 68, not blind. Sara laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded. It's early, Sara said. Good, her mother said. Take your time. The 6 months became a kind of education in a life Sara had not known she was capable of. She began volunteering at Diana's clinic 2 days a week, doing the kind of primary care medicine she had not practiced since medical school. It was humbling. Surgery had given her a very specialized, very procedural relationship with the human body, and the generalist care of a small-town clinic required a different kind of attention, broader, more relational, more attuned to the whole person in front of you rather than the specific anatomical problem. She found she loved it. Not in the fierce, consuming way she had loved surgery at its best, but in a quieter, more sustainable way. The patients knew her name. They asked after her mother. They brought things. A retired fisherman named George brought a smoked salmon every other week, whether or not she had done anything to deserve it. An elderly woman named Rose, who came in every month with a rotating array of manageable complaints that seemed largely to be excuses for conversation, told her she had kind eyes. She had not thought of herself as having kind eyes. She had thought of her eyes primarily as precise instruments for surgical assessment. She began to think that perhaps she had not, for a very long time, been seeing herself clearly. Diana was not a simple person to love. Sara had known this vaguely at 17, in the incomplete way a teenager knows things. She understood it more fully at 41. Diana was private. Not cold, nothing like cold, but private in the way that people are when they have learned that not everything needs to be shared, not everything needs an audience. She had her silences, which were not hostile silences but just her own, the interior life she kept carefully tended behind a warm exterior. She was stubborn, not about unimportant things but about the things that mattered to her. She held her ground with a quiet immovability that had taken Sara by surprise the first few times and that she had come to deeply respect. Diana did not argue loudly. She simply remained, which was in some ways more formidable. She was generous with her care in a way that was effortless and real, not performed. Her patients experienced it. The town experienced it. Sara experienced it in ways both large and small. The specific quality of Diana's attention, the way she listened to people as if they were saying something worth hearing, the way she remembered things, not just medical histories, but the things people mentioned in passing, the details that made a person particular. She knew that George the fisherman had a granddaughter in Seattle who was learning to play violin. She knew that Rose had been widowed for 20 years and still talked about her husband in the present tense. She knew that the teenage girl who sometimes came in alone for reproductive health visits was navigating a complicated family situation and needed to be received with care. She was, in other words, doing exactly what she had always done, giving herself to the place she had chosen to belong to. Watching her, Sara began to understand something she had spent 23 years not seeing, that she had confused staying with stagnating. She had looked at Diana's choice to stay in Clover Falls as a kind of smallness, a failure of ambition. She had been looking at it entirely wrong. Staying was its own form of courage. Putting down roots was its own act of will. Belonging somewhere was not the consolation prize for those without the nerve to leave. It was something you built, deliberately, over years. Something that required showing up over and over again, even when the world contained more exciting options. Diana had built something profound in this small town. A network of trust and care, a sense of knowing and being known, a life with real depth. And she had done it by staying when Sara had run. Sara sat with that for a long time. It was a Sunday in late October, almost 3 months since Sara's return, when the conversation they had been circling finally arrived. They were in Diana's kitchen. The Sunday soup, which had become a ritual, a long, slow Sunday afternoon cook with music playing and the dog asleep in a patch of floor sun and wine in mismatched glasses. Outside the windows, the garden was turning, the lavender grey-brown and done for the season, the maple at the back fence in its last blaze of orange. Sara was chopping onions, or at least using the onions as a reason to be doing something with her hands, when Diana said, from across the kitchen where she was stirring the stock, "What are you going to do when your leave is up?" The question dropped into the warm quiet of the kitchen. Sara set down her knife. She had been waiting for this. She had also been dreading it, not because she did not have thoughts about it, but because her thoughts were still unresolved in ways that felt important to be honest about. "I don't know," she said. Diana nodded, still stirring, not looking at her. "Okay." "That's not me avoiding the question," Sara said. "That's the genuine answer." "I know," Diana did look at her then. "I know you, believe it or not." Sara came around the island and leaned against the counter across from Diana, arms folded, looking at her. "I'm not the same person I was when I left," Sara said. "Or rather, I'm becoming something I stopped being a long time ago. I don't know what my relationship to surgery is going to be. I don't know if I can go back to a major city hospital and function in the way I was functioning. I don't know if I want to." Diana was quiet. "But I know," Sara continued, "that something here is real. What is happening between us, what is happening in me here in this town." She swallowed. "I know that's real." "It is real," Diana said carefully. "And I know that I can't be the reason you make a decision about your life. I can't be the anchor. That's not something that works. You have to want to be here because you want to be here, not because of me." "I know that," Sara said. "I do know that." She looked at Diana steadily. "But I'm also allowed to tell you that you're part of what has helped me find my way back to myself. that being here and being with you has shown me things about myself I had lost track of. That's not dependency, that's just," she searched for the word. "That's just what love does." The word landed in the kitchen, clear and irreversible. Diana had gone very still. "Sara," she said. Her voice was low and slightly unsteady for the first time Sara had heard it be that. "I know it's fast," Sara said. "I know we're rebuilding something that was put on hold for 23 years and that is not simple. I know you're protecting yourself and you should. I know I don't have a definitive answer about the future yet." She took a breath. "But I know what I feel. I've known it for a long time, even when I was running in the opposite direction." Diana crossed the kitchen. She reached up and put her hand on Sara's face, warm and deliberate, and looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that missed nothing. "I love you too," Diana said. "God help me, I have loved you in one form or another since I was 16 years old. I tried very hard to stop." A small, wry, almost smile. "It didn't work particularly well." Sara laughed, surprised, and it came out sounding almost like a sob, and Diana pulled her in and they stood in the middle of the kitchen, with the soup simmering, and the dog sighing in his floor-sun patch, holding on to each other with the particular intensity of people who have finally stopped pretending they don't need to. November came with its cold clarity and its early darks, and Sara began to understand herself differently. She had spent her career in the business of putting broken things back together. She had done it brilliantly. She had the credentials and the reputation to prove it. But she had never, she realized, applied anything like the same careful attention to her own interior life. She had treated herself the way she had sometimes seen younger colleagues treat their patients, efficiently, with an eye on the outcome, without pausing to understand what the person actually needed. She started seeing a therapist, a woman named Dr. Patricia Walsh, who had her practice in the next town, and who had the specific skill of asking questions that sounded simple and were not. The first question Dr. Walsh asked her was, "When did you last feel fully yourself?" Sara thought about it for a long time. "Probably when I was 17, she said finally, "before I decided who I was going to be." Dr. Walsh nodded, unsurprised. "And who had you decided to be?" "Someone who didn't need anything," Sara said, and then heard what she had said and sat with it. Diana's clinic was named, with complete lack of pretension, the Clover Falls Community Health Clinic. It occupied a converted Victorian house on Maple Street with a front room painted yellow and framed children's drawings on the wall from a long-ago art project with the elementary school. The staff was Diana, a medical assistant named Tommy who was 24 and extremely competent and treated Diana with devoted professional admiration, and a part-time receptionist named Alice who had worked there since the beginning and who had, Sara quickly understood, a comprehensive knowledge of the health histories of essentially everyone in town. Sara's volunteer days became 3 days, then 4. She was not practicing surgery, but she was practicing medicine, and she was finding in this practice something she had not expected. She was finding that she was good at this different kind of care, the slower, more relational kind, in ways that surprised her. She began talking with patients in a way she had never had time for in surgery, sitting with them after their exam, asking not just about symptoms, but about how they were. Listening with the quality of attention she had learned from Diana, the attention that made people feel worth hearing. An elderly man named Harold came in with a chronic pain issue that had been managed inadequately for years. Sara spent 2 hours with him, going through his history, his medications, the way his daily life was organized around his limitations. When she was done, she had a plan that was different from what he had been given before. Not dramatically different, just more attentive to him as a person. He came back 2 weeks later and told her the pain was better. He brought cookies, which he had apparently baked himself, which Tommy confirmed was an extraordinary act of appreciation in Harold's vocabulary. Sara ate the cookies at the reception desk and felt something she recognized, finally, as satisfaction. Real satisfaction. Not the professional achievement kind, which she had stopped being able to feel, but the older, more personal kind that comes from having actually helped another person live their life better. She called her department head and told him she was not ready to return. She told him she was rethinking the terms of her return. He was more understanding than she had expected. He asked her to keep him updated. She was beginning to understand that the life she had left behind was not a life she needed to go back to in its entirety. She had skills and knowledge that could serve people, but the question of how, and where, and in what form, these she was only beginning to answer. Diana's birthday was in November. She was turning 41. Sara planned something careful and personal, which is the only way she knew how to do things, even now, even when she was trying to slow down. She called Diana's closest friend in Clover Falls, a woman named Bate who had grown up with Diana and ran the bookshop on Main Street, and together they organized a small dinner at Diana's house. Just 8 people: Margaret Connolly, Bate and her wife Olivia, Tommy and his partner, Alice from the clinic, and Sara. Sara cooked. This was significant. Sara Connolly did not cook. She had existed for 15 years on hospital cafeteria food, take-out containers, and the occasional protein bar consumed at her desk. Her kitchen in the city was primarily decorative. Cooking had always seemed like something that required time she did not have and attention she could not spare. She started 3 days early. She called her mother for help, and Margaret, with barely concealed delight, came over and taught her Diana's favorite dishes with the patient, exacting thoroughness of a woman who believed in doing things properly. The dinner table was full and warm and loud in the way of people who like each other. There was wine and good food, and the easy hilarity of people who have shared years and know each other's stories. Diana sat at the head of her own table and looked around it with that particular expression Sara had come to recognize, the one that was happiness without performance, genuine and quiet. When she looked at Sara across the table, something in her expression went even quieter and more particular. After everyone had gone, they washed the dishes together in the kitchen, bumping shoulders in the comfortable way they had developed, and Diana said without preamble, "You planned all of this." "Bate helped." "You called Bate, you organized this, you cooked." Diana looked at her with something that was almost bewilderment. "You cooked for 3 days." "Your mother told me the recipes." "Sara." "Diana." Diana dried her hands on the dish towel and turned to face her fully. "You did this for me." "I love you," Sara said simply. "This is what that looks like." Diana looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped forward and kissed her, slow and certain, with her hands framing Sara's face, and Sara thought, This is the thing I spent 23 years trying to find somewhere else. This is the thing that was here all along." December brought the first real storms of the season. Clover Falls in winter was a different thing from Clover Falls in the golden amber of fall. The storms came off the Pacific with purpose, driving rain and wind that bent the trees and pushed waves high on the sea rocks. The town pulled in around itself, the way small coastal towns do in winter, becoming more interior, more communal, gathering in warm-lit places. Sara had always imagined herself as a person who needed cities. The density, the pace, the infrastructure of ambition. She had built her self-concept around urban capability, around being someone who moved through large, complex systems with authority. She had not expected to discover that she was also, at her core, a person who loved storms watched through a window with a cup of tea and someone to lean against. She had not expected to discover how much she had been missing the kind of community that knows your name. She had a conversation with her department head in early December that changed the shape of her thinking. He called to check in, as he had been doing monthly, and Sara found herself more honest with him than she had intended to be. She told him about the clinic work. She told him about what it had shown her, about the kind of medicine she was practicing and the way it felt, different from but not lesser than surgery. She told him she was not sure she could come back to the high-volume, high-pressure environment of a major surgical practice. He listened, then he said something unexpected. "You know," he said, "there's a movement in surgical training right now toward community-integrated models. Surgeons who maintain a part-time specialized practice, maybe 1 or 2 days a week at a regional hospital, and spend the rest of their time in community health or teaching or research. It's not the traditional career path, but it's happening more and more. Especially for surgeons who are doing exactly what you're describing, burning out of the pure high-volume model." Sara was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to tell me to come back full-time," she said. "I'm going to tell you to come back in whatever form actually works for you," he said. "Because I'd rather have you functioning at 80% of your former volume but actually present, than back here at 100% for 2 years before you implode again." She sat with this for days. A regional hospital, 2 or 3 hours from Clover Falls, part-time surgical practice, the cases that required her particular expertise, 3 or 4 days a week in the clinic here, the care she had come to find not just meaningful but essential to her sense of purpose. It was not the life she had built before. It was something else. Maybe something better. She talked to Diana about it on a Sunday morning in mid-December. They were sitting at Diana's kitchen table with coffee and the newspaper, which Diana still read in physical form, a habit Sara had begun to share with a surprised affection. Sara laid it out the way she laid out a surgical plan, clear, organized, the steps and considerations in order. Diana listened with her coffee cup in both hands, her elbows on the table watching Sara. When Sara finished, Diana was quiet for a moment. "I want to be clear about something," Diana said carefully. "Okays. This decision should have nothing to do with me, with us. It should be about your career and your well-being. Do you understand that?" "I know," Sara said. "I genuinely know. This is not me sacrificing a career for a relationship. This is me," she searched for the right words. "This is me redesigning a life around what I actually need, instead of around what I thought I was supposed to need." Diana looked at her steadily. "And you need this," Diana said. "You need the community work, the clinic, the slower pace." "I need to be a person, not just a practitioner," Sara said. "Yes, that's what I need." Diana set down her coffee cup. "And where would you live?" she asked quietly. The question had a weight to it. Sara looked at her. "I was hoping," she said with a carefulness that was its own kind of courage, "that you might have thoughts about that." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Diana looked at the table, then out the window at the winter garden, bare and pale and resting. "Birch Street has a guest room that no one uses," she said finally. Sara's heart did its unsubtle thing again. "That seems inefficient," Sara said. Diana looked up at her. Her eyes were bright. "It does," Diana agreed. "Very inefficient. January in Clover Falls was cold and salt-washed and beautiful in a stripped-down, skeletal way that Sara was learning to love." She moved into Diana's house on Birch Street on the first Saturday of the new year. She did not bring much. The sleek, expensive furnishings of her city apartment were already in storage. She had realized somewhere in November that she did not want them, and that letting them go felt less like loss and more like setting down a weight she had been carrying for years. She brought her books, and her grandmother's small watercolor seascape that had hung in her childhood bedroom, and her medical bag, and the things that were personal rather than architectural. Diana cleared space in the closet with the matter-of-fact practicality she brought to everything, and reorganized a bookshelf to accommodate Sara's, and moved her desk to create room for a second one, and did all of this with an ease and lack of ceremony that said, more than words would have, that this was not difficult for her, that it felt right. They spent that first Saturday unpacking in a haphazard, wandering way that kept turning into conversations and distracted tangents. By evening, not everything was in its place, but they were in their place, on the couch with huckleberry sprawled between them and a fire in the fireplace and bowls of soup on the coffee table, and Sara looked around the warm room at the life that had arranged itself around her, and felt something she had almost given up on feeling. She felt home. Not the complicated, unfinished home of her childhood, not the impersonal luxury of her city apartment. Something new, something she had not lived in before but recognized immediately. The home a person builds with another person, the specific domestic life of two people who love each other and have decided to be honest about it. She began her new arrangement in February. 2 days a week at a regional hospital 2 hours north, where her reputation had preceded her, and where she took on the complex reconstructive cases she was best at. It was humbling to walk back into a surgical suite after months away, and it was also, she discovered, genuinely wonderful. She had missed the precision of it, the focused intensity, the specific satisfaction of a complex problem solved in 3 dimensions with her hands. She had not known how much she had missed it until she had rested enough to miss it cleanly, without the accumulated exhaustion that had made the missing impossible to see. 3 days a week at the Clover Falls Community Health Clinic, where by now she knew many of the patients by name and they knew her, and where the slow relational medicine she practiced had begun to feel like a craft she was genuinely developing. And the rest, the mornings and the evenings and the Sundays and the storms and the long walks on the beach and the good dinners, and the gradual deepening life of a person who was present somewhere. This was the life she was building with Diana. On a Tuesday evening in March, 6 months after Sara had turned off her car in her mother's driveway, and not known yet what was going to come of it, she and Diana were walking on the beach in the last of the light. The spring was asserting itself tentatively, the way Pacific springs do, mild days and cold nights, and the first tentative returns of colour in the hills. The sea was grey-green and busy with wind. Huckleberry was doing something purposeful with a piece of kelp. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the companionable silence that had become one of Sara's favourite textures of their life together. She had never been able to be comfortable in silence with someone before. She had always felt the need to fill it, to perform, to produce. With Diana, silence was simply another form of togetherness. "Can I tell you something?" Diana said. "Always." "When I was in my late 20s, Diana said, I had this moment of reckoning. I had come back to Clover Falls after nursing school and I had started the work here, and everything was, objectively, going well. Good work, community, friendships. But I was also very aware that you were out there somewhere doing the things you had left to do, and I had stayed, and for a while I wondered if I had stayed because I was brave or because I was afraid." Sara looked at her. "And then one night I was walking on this beach," Diana continued, "and it came to me very clearly. It wasn't fear, it was choice. I had chosen something real. I had chosen a life I actually wanted, not a life I was supposed to want." She paused, and that made all the difference. Sara thought about this. "What was the thing you wanted?" she asked. "This," Diana said simply. She gestured not dramatically, just an easy gesture that encompassed the beach and the sea and the town behind them, and Sara understood themselves. "A real life, here, where I belong." Sara took Diana's hand. They walked in silence for a while, the sea moving beside them, Huckleberry conducting his kelp project with complete absorption. "I spent 23 years, Sara said eventually, looking for the thing you had already found." "I know," Diana said, not unkindly, just truthfully. "I'm a late bloomer," Sara said. Diana laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and Sara felt it move through her like sunlight. "You're right on time," Diana said. "As it turns out, no love story that lasts is only warmth and walks and Sunday soup. Real love, the kind that holds through seasons and not just spring, contains the harder things too, the arguments, the moments of fear, the places where two people's wounds align in uncomfortable ways." Sara and Diana had those too. It would be dishonest to suggest they did not. Sara's control was a problem. She had spent 15 years in an environment where control was not just acceptable but necessary, where precision and certainty and the management of outcomes were survival skills. She brought those habits to her personal life. She had a difficult time with uncertainty that wasn't medical. She had a difficult time accepting that some things, the things that involved other people's feelings, could not be managed. There was an evening in February when they argued, really argued for the first time, about something that started as something small and opened up into something larger. Sara had made plans for them without asking, had organized an evening with the assumption that Diana would want the same thing she wanted, had been startled, and then stiff when Diana said she needed a different kind of evening. Diana, to her credit, was direct. "You managed me," she said. "You decided what we were doing and you told me instead of asking." "I thought you'd want." "I'm sure you thought that," Diana said, "but you didn't ask. You made the choice for both of us and then you were surprised that I didn't reflect your choice back to you." She looked at Sara steadily. "I'm not a surgical outcome, Sara. I'm a person." The words landed hard. Sara went quiet. She had the defensive responses available, had them lined up, could have deployed them. She chose not to. "You're right," she said. "I'm sorry." Diana looked at her for a moment. "I know you are." A pause. "This is a habit, you know that. It's going to take time to unlearn." "I know. I'm not going anywhere because of a habit," Diana said. "But you have to be willing to work on it." "I am willing," Sara said. "I am." And she meant it. She took it to therapy. She sat with the discomfort of understanding where it came from, the control, the assumption, the management, not just as professional habits but as protective ones, the habits of a person who had learned early that not needing anything from anyone was the safest position. She was working on needing. It was harder than surgery. Diana had her own things. She had the self-sufficiency that can shade into isolation. The habit, built over years of managing everything alone, of not asking for help, of defaulting to handling things herself even when she was struggling. Sara would sometimes notice it, the particular set of Diana's shoulders when she was carrying something she hadn't mentioned, the way she would get very busy in the kitchen or very focused on work when something was bothering her. It had taken weeks for Sara to understand the pattern. It took more weeks to figure out how to move toward it without being intrusive. She learned to ask in the evening gently without pressure, "How are you actually doing?" The actually was important. Diana answered fine reflexively. The actually opened a different door. Sometimes Diana would answer the same way regardless. Sometimes she would set down what she was doing and look at Sara with something careful moving in her eyes and say, "I'm having a hard time with something." And then they would sit and Sara would listen, really listen, the way Diana had taught her by example, and it was not always easy, and it was not always resolved cleanly, but it was real. They were together, learning things that neither of them had fully learned alone. By spring, they had been together for 6 months. By the standards of relationships, this was not very long. By the standards of people who had known each other for 23 years and spent most of that time in an unresolved state of loving at a distance, it was both new and very old. The ordinary life they shared was the thing Sara found herself most attached to in ways she had not expected. The mornings, Diana up first always, the smell of coffee pulling Sara out of sleep, and the kitchen already warm when she came downstairs, and Diana at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on and the paper open, and Huckleberry making his morning enthusiasm known, and the particular quality of early light through the kitchen windows. The evenings, which belonged to them in a different way, quieter, longer. Books or music or the television show they were working through together, Diana with her feet in Sara's lap, Sara's hand absent and automatic on Diana's ankle, both of them inside their own reading or watching and occasionally commenting, and occasionally just being together in the easy way that is the daily texture of love. The arguments and the making up, which were their own kind of intimacy, the specific, patient work of knowing each other well enough to be honest without being unkind. Sunday soup still always. Huckleberry, who had decided after approximately 4 days that Sara was his person too, and slept at her feet with the confident loyalty of a dog who does not entertain doubts. Margaret Connolly, who came to dinner every other Thursday and who had the slightly smug expression of a woman who had been waiting many years for her daughter to find her way home, and had proven correct in her patience. Bate and Olivia, Diana's oldest friends, who had absorbed Sara into their friendship group with the warmth of people who had been rooting for Diana's happiness for a long time and were glad to see it. The clinic and the hospital, and the ongoing construction of a professional life that actually fitted the person Sara was becoming. The beach, every morning almost without exception. Rain or shine, the sea making its patient sound, the three of them, the 2 women and the opinionated dog, walking the shoreline and talking or not talking and watching the light on the water change. One evening in April, they were sitting on the back porch watching the garden come back to life, the lavender putting out new growth, the wild strawberries flowering, and Diana said almost idly, "Do you miss it?" "Miss what?" "The city, the major hospital, the life you built." Sara thought about it honestly. "I miss some things," she said. "I miss a few colleagues. I miss the specific adrenaline of a very complex surgery which I still get sometimes at the regional but not as often," she considered. "I miss the feeling of being certain about who I was and what I was for." A pause. "But I think that certainty was partly false. It was a kind of armor. I confused having a strong identity with actually knowing myself." Diana was quiet. "Do you regret any of it?" Diana asked. "No," Sara said, and then more carefully, "I think I had to build what I built, even if I had to knock most of it down. I think I needed to understand what I was capable of before I could understand what I actually wanted." She looked at Diana. The tragedy wouldn't have been doing it. The tragedy would have been doing it and never coming home. Diana reached over and took her hand in the quiet, casual way she had, the way that had stopped surprising Sara and started feeling like breathing. "I'm glad you came home," Diana said. "I'm glad I came home," Sara said. Above the garden, the first stars were appearing in the pale spring sky. From somewhere in the house, Huckleberry's collar clinked against something as he shifted position in his sleep. The evening settled around them, warm and particular, theirs. Let me tell you about a day in May, an ordinary day, about 8 months after Sara Connolly came home. She woke up at 6:30 to the smell of coffee and the sound of rain, soft and coastal, against the window. She lay still for a moment with her eyes closed, locating herself in the day. Tuesday. Clinic day. She became aware of the warmth of Diana beside her, the specific weight and presence of the person she loved still in the process of waking, that gradual return from sleep that Diana did slowly and at her own pace, and that Sara had come to find endearing in a way she would not have predicted. She got up and dressed quietly and let Diana sleep another half-hour, the way Diana did on clinic mornings, stealing that last 30 minutes with the focused efficiency of someone who knows their own needs. She took Huckleberry out into the wet garden in the rain, which he found simultaneously objectionable and acceptable, and they stood under the big maple, and she let him take his time, and she watched the rain come down through the new leaves and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a thing she was still learning. The skill of not filling every moment with planning or assessment, the practice of standing in the rain with a dog and finding that sufficient. Diana came down at 7, her hair still damp from the shower, in the green sweater Sara had bought her without quite meaning to. It had simply been the exact right colour for Diana, and Sara had bought it. She moved through the kitchen with her usual morning efficiency, making eggs while Sara made toast, working around each other in the kitchen the way they had learned to, a small choreography of proximity and awareness. They ate at the kitchen table, with the rain against the windows and Diana reading and Sara with her tablet and Huckleberry in his corner with his breakfast, and the radio on low, and no one talking much because no one needed to. At 8 they walked to the clinic, sharing Diana's umbrella again, which had become such a routine that it had lost all romantic charge and acquired something better, the ease of habit. The town moved around them in its Tuesday morning way. George waved from his truck. The coffee stand on Harbour Road was opening as they passed. The bookshop was putting out its sidewalk display of weather-treated books, bait visible through the window in the process of something architectural with the bookshelves. The clinic opened at 8:30. Tommy arrived in his rain gear looking improbably cheerful, which was his default state. Alice opened up the front desk with her usual comprehensive efficiency. The first patient was an 8-year-old with an ear infection. Sara did the exam and prescribed the antibiotics, and spent an extra 5 minutes talking to the child about the book she had brought to read in the waiting room, a chapter book about a girl who discovers she can talk to horses, and the child explained the entire plot to her with great animation and complete disregard for spoilers, and Sara listened with real attention. Because the child was interesting, and also because Diana had walked by in the hallway and given her a small private smile for being the kind of doctor who listened to children explain their books. George brought the smoked salmon at noon on schedule. Alice put the kettle on. Tommy ate 3/4 of it before Sara noticed, at which point there was a brief and spirited negotiation. In the afternoon, a new patient, a woman who had recently moved to Clover Falls from a city further south, who had not yet seen a doctor here, who sat in the exam room with the slightly overwhelmed look of someone navigating a major life change. She was a teacher. She had moved here because she was tired of the city. She was not entirely sure she had made the right decision. Sara sat across from her and took her history carefully. She asked the standard questions, and then she asked a few that were not standard. "How are you finding it here?" The woman looked surprised by the question. I don't know yet, it's different." "It is different," Sara said. "I left here at 18 and spent 23 years telling myself I needed the city. I came back 8 months ago." "And..." Sara looked at her steadily. "And I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The woman looked at her for a moment. Something in her face eased. "That's good to hear," she said. At 5 o'clock, Sara locked up the clinic while Diana finished a call with a specialist in the city about a referral. She stood on the sidewalk outside in the end-of-rain light, that particular post-rain early evening quality of light that turns everything gold and washed and new, and she waited. Diana came out and locked the door behind her, and turned and found Sara looking at her with an expression that Sara had decided, sometime in the past several months, to stop trying to hide. "What?" Diana said. "Nothing," Sara said, "just you." Diana shook her head, but she was smiling in the way that was only for Sara, the private one, the one she didn't perform. They walked home. The rain had finished and the town was damp and gleaming and the hills were very green. They stopped at the market for wine and something for dinner, and argued briefly and enjoyably about what to make, and settled on something neither of them had planned, which turned out to be the best kind of dinner. Huckleberry greeted them at the door with his full ceremonial enthusiasm, as if they had been away for years rather than 8 hours. They made dinner together in the kitchen, music on, wine poured, and talked about their days in the way Sara had not talked to anyone about her days in years. Not reporting, not summarizing, Actually talking, the kind where the other person already knows the context and the characters, and where what you are really doing is thinking together. After dinner on the couch, the book and the television negotiation, which Diana won because she won most negotiation, not through force but through the same quiet immovability she brought to everything. Huckleberry between them, and then gradually not between them, as he relocated to the foot of the couch with the discretion of a dog who understands the room. Rain started again, soft against the windows. Diana set down her book and looked at Sara with that direct quality of attention that still, 8 months in, made Sara feel completely seen in a way she was still getting used to. "I have a question for you," Diana said. "Okays. Are you happy?" The same question Sara had been asked in different words, by Dr. Walsh, by her mother, by herself, in the dark of her city apartment on the night everything changed. She did not have to think about this one. "Yes," she said, simply directly with her whole self behind it. "Yes, I am." Diana nodded, satisfied, and picked up her book again. Sara looked at the rain on the window and listened to the sound of the house around them, its old wood and its warmth and the dogs breathing and the faint creak of the maple outside, and she felt the singular feeling of a life that fits. I want to tell you what Sara left behind when she drove away from Clover Falls at 18, because leaving it is not the same as losing it, and losing it is not the same as never having had it. She left behind a mother who had been waiting, a town that had known her name, a beach that she had loved without knowing she was allowed to love something so simple. And she left behind Diana, who had stood in a driveway and cried, and then gone in and made herself a life anyway, with the stubborn grace of someone who had learned early that love cannot wait indefinitely for the person who is afraid of it. She left behind the version of herself that had not yet learned to be ambitious. That is not nothing. She needed to go. She needed to build what she built, to understand what she was capable of, to find the edges of her own ability and discover that she could stand at those edges without falling. She needed the city and the hospital and the 15 years of scalpels. They made her. But they also, in the end, broke her open, and that breaking was also necessary. Because in the breaking there was a return, not a defeat, not a retreat, a return the way a person returns to a root system after a long journey above ground. Sara Connolly came home and found herself there, the self that had been waiting with the same patient steadiness as Diana, as her mother, as the town, as the sea. Diana Reeves had always known she was gay. This had not been a struggle for her in the way it is for some people, though neither had it been entirely uncomplicated. A small town in the 90s contained its own pressures, its own silences, its own careful navigation. She had moved through it with the quiet self-possession that was her nature, knowing what she knew, being patient with the rest. The first person she had told was Sara, on a summer evening at 17, sitting on Sara's back porch after everyone else had gone home. She had told her with the terrifying vulnerability of someone handing over something fragile, not knowing if it would be held carefully. Sara had taken her hand and said, "Me too." They had sat there in the summer dark for a long time, two 17-year-olds at the beginning of understanding themselves, holding on to each other with the specific tenderness of recognition. And then the year had passed and Sara had left and Diana had spent 23 years being in many ways fine. She had had her work, her community, her friends, her relationship with Claire that had been real and good even in its ending. She had been by any honest measure okay. But there was a room in her interior life that she had kept closed, a room she visited sometimes in the quiet, alone, not with grief, not anymore, but with a kind of awareness, the awareness of something unresolved, something she had not been able to finish. When Sara came back and stood on the beach in the fog, older and tired and more herself than Diana had expected, Diana had felt that room open. She had been careful, she had protected herself or tried to, she had been honest about her limits and her fears, she had not rushed. But she had also known, somewhere below the careful protection, the thing she had always known. That this was the person, that this had always been the person. She had simply had to wait for her to find her way home. In Dr. Walsh's office in February, Sara wrote a letter. It was not a therapeutic exercise Dr. Walsh had assigned, exactly. It had simply come out of a session in which they had been talking about the leaving, the 18-year-old leaving, and what Sara would want to say to herself now if she could reach backward. She wrote it by hand, which she had not done since medical school, and it took her 2 sessions to complete. It went something like this: Dear Sara at 18. I know you think you are running toward something. You are partly. You are running toward a self you need to discover, toward an ability you need to test, toward a life large enough to contain what you feel pressing against you. That part is real and it matters, and I won't tell you not to go. But I want you to understand something before you go. The girl standing in the driveway is not a chapter of your life that you are closing. She is not something you are going to find an equivalent of somewhere else. She is specific and irreplaceable, and what exists between you is not a function of your age or your circumstances. It is a function of who you both are. You will not feel this with anyone else. Not in this way. I know you are afraid of it. I know it feels like if you let yourself stay for it, you will become someone smaller. I know you have built your whole sense of yourself around being someone who leaves, who goes, who expands. And I know the staying feels like defeat. It isn't. The staying would have been its own kind of courage. You'll understand that eventually. You just have to go through a lot of detours first. The good news is that you get there. Late and the long way around, but you get there. She is still there, the beach is still there, the town is still there. Home is still there. Come back when you're ready. You will be ready. With love. Sara at 41. She showed the letter to Diana eventually. On a Sunday evening in March, in Diana's living room, with the fire going and the rain outside and Huckleberry asleep in his corner. Diana read it quietly and didn't say anything for a while. Then she folded it carefully and handed it back. She did the best she could, Diana said. 18-year-old Sara, she really did. I know, Sara said. And she came back, Diana said. So, Sara agreed. Diana took her hand, the way she did, easy and complete. Outside, the rain fell on the town where they both belonged. The anniversary of Sara's return fell on a Thursday in late September. She had not planned to mark it in any particular way. It was not a conventional anniversary. There was no holiday card for 1 year since you drove away from your burned-out city life and came home and found love in the most obvious place. And yet she felt the day arrive with a particular weight, not heavy, more like the weight of something completed. She was at the regional hospital for a surgical case that morning. A complex reconstruction, the kind she still loved, the kind that required everything she had and gave back the clean satisfaction of a problem solved with skill. She worked for 6 hours with the full attention she now had to give, because she was not exhausted from running herself to nothing, and she sutured the last layer with the same care she always had, and when she stepped out of the suite and pulled down her mask, she felt unmistakably the satisfaction that had abandoned her. She drove back to Clover Falls in the early afternoon, through the hills and the coast road, the sea appearing in its grey-green expanse as the road curved, and her chest did the thing it had started doing, the thing of recognition. Of home. She stopped at the flower stand outside the market. George was there, of all people, picking up something he had apparently ordered. He greeted her with the gruff warmth of a man who does not say much but means everything he does say, and asked after her mother, and told her that Diana's clinic had helped his wife last month in a way he had not forgotten. She bought lavender, because it was Diana's garden and Diana's favourite, and there was something right about bringing the thing that was already there. She drove up Birch Street and parked and sat in the car for a moment. 1 year ago, she had sat in a dark apartment and cried without knowing what she was crying about. She got out of the car and went inside. Diana was in the kitchen, home early, making tea, and she looked up when Sara came in with the particular quality of seeing her that Sara had come to understand was not just recognition, but something more deliberate, the specific, chosen quality of someone who had decided to really look. You're back, Diana said. I'm back, Sara said. She put the lavender on the counter. Diana looked at it and then at Sara with the private smile. How was the surgery? Diana said. Good, Sara said, really good. Yes, I felt it again, Sara said. The thing I thought I'd lost, I felt it. She looked at Diana. I have you to thank for that, by the way. You did that yourself, Diana said. I had help, Sara said. Diana was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the lavender and smelled it and set it back down. Do you want tea? She said. Yes, Sara said, very much. They made tea in the kitchen of the house on Birch Street, with the late September light coming through the windows and Huckleberry pressing against Sara's legs in his welcome home performance, And the day moved around them, warm and ordinary and entirely, exactly what they had both been looking for. There is a kind of love that people talk about as if it is a destination, as if you travel toward it and then you arrive, and the arrival is the end of the story. Sara and Diana knew a different kind, the kind that is a practice, the kind that requires showing up every day and choosing it again, not because it is hard but because it is real, and real things require tending. They walked the beach every morning. The seasons changed around them, the summer fog burned off, the fall storms arrived, the winter stripped the hills, the spring came back, and they were there in it in the dailiness of a shared life, in the specific beauty of a place they both belonged to. Sara had rebuilt her relationship to her work. She operated 2 days a week and practiced community medicine 3 days a week, and she had for the first time a professional life that felt sustainable and true. She was teaching herself to be present in the operating room and present in the exam room and present at home, 3 different kinds of presence, each requiring something different, all of them drawing on the same well, the well that she was finally, carefully keeping full. Diana ran the clinic with the same steady attention she had always given it, and was slowly allowing herself to accept help in the way she had always been too proud to before. She was learning to let Sara into the hard places, not just the easy ones, which was its own act of ongoing courage. They argued sometimes, they got it wrong sometimes, they sat with the difficult things and worked through them with the tools that mature people build, patience and honesty, and the willingness to be the one who says I'm sorry first. They loved each other with the specific, chosen, daily quality of people who had come the long way around and knew what they had. Huckleberry was, by all accounts, perfectly content with the arrangements. Margaret Connolly said nothing, but had a manner of unmistakable satisfaction about her. She was right and she knew it, and she was gracious enough to mostly not say so. The town of Clover Falls held them both the way small places hold the people who belong to them, with familiarity and particular regard, with the knowledge that only comes from time and presence, and the quiet accumulation of shared history. And the sea was there as it had always been, making its patient sound at the edge of everything. The sea that had watched this town and its people through generations of leaving and returning, through all the complicated human business of love and fear and growing and coming home. The sea does not judge the ones who leave, it does not prefer the ones who stay. It simply waits, it simply receives. It knows, the way all patient and enduring things know, that the ones who are meant to come back always do.